what does atheism offer?
Well, it offers the chance of living without illusion, which I think it says that philosophy and literature will do a great deal more for you. There's a lot more morality in them. There's a lot more ethical discussion in Dostoevsky, say.
It may be true, but who will present them in our society, in a real society? Who will present them in a way to create structure?
For now, I'm presenting.
There he is.
For now, I'm presenting. Right? I can't do...
You're going to be very busy.
I can only appear in my own person here. I can even say that to some extent it works for me. This irony, I think, is tremendously useful, as is philosophy, especially the philosophy of Spinoza, especially in times of anguish. And the realization that there's no false consolation can actually cheer you up. Once you face the fact that you're born into a losing struggle, things immediately appear a great deal more manageable in some ways.
So many people throughout the ages. Picture a man. He lives his life. He makes his meaning based on the religion he's been presented from a young person. And he finds peace in that. And a lot of the dogmas and beliefs of the religion he's presented, he may not really subscribe to. He doesn't read all the texts and think about it that much, but he finds peace in it. So my question for you is, what's the harm? I know beliefs have impact and beliefs have consequences. So my question for you is, what's the harm of an individual or so many people throughout the ages who live their lives finding peace, having a religion, live and die and believe as they do?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, actually, there is something that will be familiar to many of you that I think is worth saying at this point, which is the problem with dogmatism is that you actually can never be sure what the harms will be, and they can be just astonishingly bad all of a sudden. And because dogmatism, the state of being dogmatic, the state of believing things strongly despite an absence of evidence or even in the face of counter evidence, that is the state of having no error-correcting mechanisms in your worldview. I mean, you're simply not available to reality, so you are just going to continually bump into hard objects wherever you go. And so you take, and my favorite example of this, and I should have said this several times, but it's just worth pondering, that you can have a dogma which on its face is the most benign and life-affirming dogma there is. So the dogma that life starts at the moment of conception and all human life is sacred, right? All of it is sacred. We just have to privilege just the human being from the moment of conception as being an entity that has to be treated as an end in itself and never as a means. Now, what harm is going to come from that? That is the most life-affirming and most careful disposition you could possibly have. But then we get something like embryonic stem cell research, or then we have the family planning needs of women and girls who get raped, right? And then all of a sudden, the people who are sure, based on pure dogmatism, that a soul that if you could hold it in your hand would be invisible to you. If you could hold 1,000 in your hand, they'd be invisible to you. Those souls in those fertilized ova are just as important as the souls in this room, right? That's a dogma that's responsible for an immense amount of harm, and yet you wouldn't have foreseen it. And so the problem is to have a way of thinking about the world that doesn't allow you to reliably navigate because you are not basing your worldview on evidence and argument. That's the problem, and it's always surprising.
A good way to tease people who think that the soul enters the body at conception is just confront them with monozygotic twins. Which twin has the soul? Right. And which twin is the zombie? I mean, Sam is, of course, perfectly right. There are all sorts of unforeseen evil consequences. But I have another answer to this very, very well thought out question, which is that I'm not sure that I really care whether it does harm or not. I care about whether it's true. And even more strongly than that, I care that children are brought up denied access to the very, very beautiful truths which we are uncovering, science in particular is uncovering over the centuries. We live in a wonderfully privileged century from this point of view. We live at a time when not everything is known, but an enormous amount is known. And it's a great privilege of those who are born in this century to be told what we do know about the world, about the universe, about life, about how we come to be here. And it almost makes you weep to think of children who are being deprived of this by ignorant, bigoted parents who are teaching them nonsense. Because it's, I don't know, because it's comforting or because it comes down through the family, it's their tradition, it's in the Holy Book. I mean, what a tragedy for the children concerned to live their lives deprived of the wonder of knowledge.
Christopher, what about the solace of faith? Some of the most religious people I know ended up there.
Oh, this is a softball. I want a hard question.
Well, no, I mean...
I know what he's going to say to this.
Well, maybe, but he's been
hard-minded, hard-hearted, non-needer of solace.
Worse, you're a misanthrope because you're not sympathetic to people's need for religion.
I say in my book, available at fine bookstores everywhere, that as long as I don't have to hear about it, I don't mind what people believe. If they say, well, thanks to Joseph Smith and his gold plates, I have real faith now, and I've got a family, and I have friends, and I have a real system, and so on, I say, fine, just don't come to my front door with it. Don't ask for a tax break for it. Don't ask my children to be taught it in the schools.
Did you sign up tonight thinking you wouldn't hear about it?
And I asked the question in the book. People think they have a personal relationship with the Creator, and they're the possessors of a wonderful secret. It must feel, I've never felt it, but I presume it feels great. Why doesn't it make them happy? They're not happy. They can't be happy till everyone else believes it too. They go out and proselytize, very often, and here's, I can't let your last answer go, very often in the guise of charity. You notice how often that religion, rather than answer the questions that I've put, like, how do you know there's a God? What evidence do you have for it? Which you say, well, lots of good people do good things because they're religious. Well, let's take the most recent pressing case. Richard Dawkins and I and a few others, in the response to the Haiti earthquake, set up an emergency charity for people of non-belief to give to, because so many charitable organizations are, in fact, proselytizing groups. So we raised about $2 million in a weekend. And all that money goes straight. By the way, thank you. If you go to Richard's website, you can find out more about how to donate to this, because it's permanent. It's going to stay in being. All that money went straight to Doctors Without Borders, of course, and the International Red Cross, which, though it has a cross, isn't a religious organization. Both these organizations are already in Haiti. They're proven. None of the money goes to support any missionary activity. None. And the Scientologists and all the others who turned up in Haiti, and the people who turned up in Haiti to kidnap babies to convert them to their faith, and the Catholics who turned up and said, standing in the ruins of their own cathedral, with 250,000 Haitians buried under the rubble, said, God spoke here today, and you should listen to his message. Don't tell me that's good. Don't tell me that's good. That's wicked. It's proselytizing. It's proselytizing with the helpless, using them as objects of charity and conversion. It's lying to people.
But there's also a lot of
wrong to lie. It's wrong to lie to people, and it's giving them false hopes and false explanations for their plight. Now, we're not guilty of any of that. And now I'll ask you another question. Where in the Decalogue does the word goodness appear? Where? That's a good swathe of Exodus for you. Where in Exodus does the word goodness appear? Where in this commandment-rich territory does the word goodness or the enjoyment to be good occur? This should be a softball for you.
Okay.
It's first of all, it tells you what you ought not to do. It says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." In the book of Leviticus. I mean, I'm allowed to move to Leviticus from Exodus.
Yes,
I think that's fair.
Right.
Yes, that's fair.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, in Leviticus and in Exodus, if you're a neighbor, you better not, and you're supposed to love him. This person had better not be an Amalekite, a Midianite, a Moabite. Better not be a witch.
Yep.
The destruction of whom is enjoined. Better not be a homosexual, the stoning of whom is enjoined. Better not be a slave, the terms of enslavement of which are all laid out. Now, these are primitive, tribal, agricultural. Most of the commandments, by the way, all the Decalogue, by the way, is addressed to the property-owning classes. Here's what you can't do with your servants. Here, your servants must also obey this commandment. Why are the commandments addressed only to people who have staff? Why are the women, rather a large objection, I would have thought, why are the women counted as part of the animal and chattel that's disposable by these holders of property? Couldn't it be any more obvious that this is a man-made phenomenon, and at a time when people were not at their best and were full of fear and ignorance and greed and covetousness of other people's property?
Can we be faithful and not be trapped by history? Not all of its elements are
Well, it's not only that, but as Christopher knows very well, I assume that the Bible was put together by human beings, and that the Jewish tradition is a long evolving tradition, as are other traditions, in which the dross of history is gradually refined in the same way that you would not expect someone 3,000 years ago to be able to understand the sort of arguments that you're making tonight. People change. There's an evolutionary process also, not only to biology, but to sociology, to ideology, all of those things. And that's why the question is very much, does religion make people better? And can these systems refine themselves? And can they get rid of the stuff that's bad in religion? And I think that to assume that you can cherry pick the things and the statements in religion that are negative, and those things are necessarily enduring, contradicts the history of every tradition I know.
Well, cherry picking is an odd word to use for something that's thrust upon you. I've got no choice but to study the Decalogue.
No, actually,
I point out it says it's addressed to property owners and enjoining them to keep women as property owners.
So are you?
You're cherry picking.
Are you
nitpicking.
Are you in favor of theft, murder, and adultery? Do you think those are good things?
Well, here's exactly the nub of my question. If what you say is true,
yes.
Not that, and I've never said, I couldn't be interpreted as having said no religious person can do a good thing. But if what you say is true, this should be true, and you should find it easy to point it out.
Okay.
There must be something, not that they can do or do, but that I cannot do, that's a good thing. Either a moral statement made, or a moral or ethical statement performed, that a person of faith could perform that I cannot.
Now,
you must be able to identify that.
No, actually,
if your point is to have any
how can one human being do something that another human being can't do physically? Physically, of course, you could do anything that I could do, but I can say lots of things you don't do. I can say lots of things you don't do, not that you can't do. You probably don't do, as I do, bless your child on a Friday night. You probably don't create great works of art based on religion. You probably don't go halfway across the world feeling that you're motivated and called by a God who tells you to help other human beings. I mean, all those things are things that religion motivates people to do. Not that you can't do them, but that people generally don't do them if they're not motivated by religion.
No, get real. I mean, pronouncing an incantation isn't a moral action.
Of course it is.
Or is it? No, it isn't.
It's only not a moral action if you don't feel
subjectively
the enormous.
It's not a moral action. Anyway, it is something. It is something I could do.
It's not. I know. Of course you can, and I encourage you to do it.
Yeah.
It's only not a moral action
one day.
if you don't feel the unique expression of love when it takes place in an atmosphere of sanctity that is not the same as saying to a child, "I love you." I have to tell you. I mean, some of you knew my father, who passed away in May, who was a rabbi. When I think of the most powerful and intimate moments that I had with my father, it was when he put his hands on my head and blessed me on a Friday night. Now, he would not have done that were he not religious, and it wasn't the same as when he kissed me goodnight and said, "I love you," because there is an element in which religious people dwell. It's called a world of sanctity that you can't invoke and can't dwell in if you don't believe that that realm exists.
Christopher,
So well, wait. First, I'm sorry for your loss, as the Irish say. Sorry for your trouble.
Right.
Second, but I'm still going to have to insist, I don't think anyone in the audience can consider that's an answer to my challenge.
Of course
I have to say there's a moral or ethical statement or action that an unbeliever could not perform.
But could not means that you're physically incapable of it. And
No.
I'm willing to concede
No, if
right
it's
here,
goodness, it would
you
be
can
morally
do everything I can do.
Well, let's
Of
not go
course
that
you
far.
can.
Let's go.
Of course you can.
All right. Well, then. Okay.
I mean,
all right.
you have to say wouldn't do. You
well,
can't say
I will leave,
can't
since
do.
you won't answer it, I'll just leave the question to the audience. If anyone
I
can
just
come
did
up to
it.
me and say, here's a moral thing you couldn't do, not don't do, but could not do, that only a religious person do, I'd be very interested to hear of it. No one's ever come up with anyone.
let me ask you a
Second,
question.
there was a brief corollary. Think of a wicked thing done, or evil thing said, that is done precisely because of faith. You've already thought of one.
But any that,
Wait.
but any that someone who doesn't have
And
faith
now
couldn't
you've-
do?
and now
Wait,
you've
tell
got-
me one that
No,
someone who
I
doesn't
didn't-
have
no.
faith could not do.
I didn't say that.
Okay, but that's exactly the point.
No, it's not.
A human being can do certain things, whether they're believers or not. They have the physical ability.
It still doesn't.
Believing something doesn't give you a new
it's to
physical
you,
ability.
It's no problem to you that the suicide murder community, the genital mutilation community, these are all faith-based communities.
Do you want
and
me to
while we're
answer
on the
that?
subject of charity, who doesn't hear Hamas saying, the reason we're loved by our people is because we provide social services. We help the needy. We're the only people who come out and do that, which is, by the way, I'm horrified to have to say is true. But do you excuse them for that because they're charitable?
Of course
No.
not.
Do you not think that they bless their children a whole lot?
Yes, and I think
you
that that's a
could-
beautiful
I've
thing
heard
that they
them
do.
it.
Right.
You try
But
being.
I don't think
a
they're-
Muslim children and not be a child not be blessed the entire time. That's part of the authority that they claim. They claim
Christopher,
to
I
own these
want
people.
to ask,
This is all faith-based.
who steps up to, you won't like any of the language, but life has a lot of despair. People fall into despair. Who steps up to save? And I don't mean in Christian terms necessarily at all, but who steps up to reach out to those people? And for society as a whole, if you don't have the teaching of religion, what will offer a kind of moral construct? I don't see it in schools. Union halls are gone. Who's going to give people
I live in such a world.
structure of
I live in such a
meaning?
world. It's called Hollywood. You see
Hollywood.
what happens.
Well,
Yeah,
exactly. I mean,
right.
it may have blemishes. It may be deeply flawed. It may be fatally flawed, you would say. But what's the substitute? What's the structure for moral teaching
I
and
think-
save the despairing?
I think despair is quite a good starting point myself. I mean, I think it's very good to know that we're born into a losing struggle. I think that the stoicism that comes from that and the reflection that comes from that is very useful. I'm not very impressed by people who say, well, I wish it wasn't true, so I'll try and act as if it isn't. It is true. Everything is governed by entropy and decline and annihilation and disaster. And you're born into a losing struggle, and because you're a primate mammal, you know you are, and you know you're going to die, and that there'll be a lot of struggle and pain on the way. I don't want a world without anxiety and grief and pain and struggle. I can't get it.
No one's saying you
But
can't
those
have
who offer
that.
it to me, I spurn the gift. I don't want what you want. I don't want the feeling of eternal love and peace. Love and peace, very, very overrated in my view. One of the many reasons, actually, I should despise all religions equally, but and I do in a way. But one way which I prefer Judaism to its rivals is that the emphasis is more on justice than on love.
I want to go to the rabbi. Why is that not misanthropic of you? That attitude.
Misanthropic doesn't mean I have to hate people.
Well,
It means I respect.
It's hard.
It means
Too
I
bad.
respect them enough. It means I respect them enough not to offer them false consolation.
I do think it's important.
The realm of illusion will not help you to cure this condition.
This question is directed to both Mr. Dawkins and Mr. Harris. There's been a question rolling around in my mind about the authenticity of what counts as a follower of a specific umbrella religion, say Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, is a Lutheran or Christian. Well, what constitutes a real Muslim? Someone who's more liberal, someone who's an Islamist. What's a real Jew? Or someone who follows Reform Judaism as opposed to the more orthodox interpretation of the religion.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one reason why I'm a fan of zeroing in on specific beliefs and their consequences. So it's not trying to find the, quote, authentic Muslim or authentic Christian I don't think it's a project anyone needs to ever be engaged in. You just need to know what someone believes on points that really matter. So how do you think gays should be treated? How do you think women should be treated? What do you think happens after you die? Do you think there's a paradise that martyrs go to? I mean, these are all crucial questions which any adherent of any one of those faiths will use in their own mind as a litmus test to judge whether or not someone is devout enough or following or interpreting the scripture the way they're doing it. But I don't think we ever really need to know. I mean, there's just radical diversity, and there's a range of commitments that we never really have to we never have to bound in any.
No, I agree with that, except that politicians may. This arises in Britain particularly, where actually in the every 10 years we have a census, and people are invited to tick a box as to which religion they belong to, and quite a large number of people in the 2001 census ticked the Christian box. It dropped from 72% to about 54% in the 2011 census. But you might say, well, who cares whether they're really Christian? Who cares? I mean, it's up to them whether they really believe Jesus was the Son of God, or Jesus is your Lord and Savior, or born of a virgin and things. But it does matter when politicians, who after all commission the census, make use of the figure 72% Christian. Say, right, Britain is a Christian country, therefore we need to pass legislation in accordance with Christian beliefs, let's say about abortion or something of that sort. And this actually did happen in Britain. So when my British foundation, the British branch of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, we actually commissioned a poll in Britain on the day, in the week after the 2011 census, to ask people who ticked the Christian box, what do you really believe? Because we suspected that although they ticked the Christian box, they didn't really believe in many of the tenets. By the way, it's tenets, not tenants, as was said of Christianity. And the reason we thought it mattered was precisely that politicians had used the figure 72% Christian in the 2001 census to enact legislation in accordance with what they thought were the beliefs of the British people. So I do think that to some extent it does matter.
That's why Pew, the polling organization, often does a religion survey, and they ask specific questions. They don't ask as many as I would want them to ask, but they ask questions that tease out the gradations of belief. You know, how old do you think the universe is? Yes.
And by the way, the result of our poll was that the people who ticked the Christian box, very, very few of them actually held the sorts of beliefs that you might think were Christian beliefs, like Jesus is my Lord and Savior, virgin birth, the Bible is true, that kind of thing.
May I ask, Christopher Hitchens, you've debated Rabbi David Wolpe on this subject. You've debated the Reverend Al Sharpton.
Yes.
What's the difference between these debates?
Well, the Reverend Al Sharpton is another case of the damage done to society by religion, because once it was agreed by the rest of America that black people are best led by preachers, and once it was agreed to write out of the civil rights record the heroic black secularists like Bayard Rustin and the great black union leader Philip Randolph, who actually organized with the help of the United Automobile Workers the March on Washington. Once all that had been forgotten, and we decide, yeah, black people, they really love their preachers, then once Dr. King has gone, it's one succession of junk demagogues after another, all of them given the mantle because they're in holy orders. There's no fraudulence you can't get away with in this country if you can get the word reverend put in front of your name.
Questions from the
Sharpton's
audience?
a very conspicuous example of that.
We'll begin right here. Madam, your question.
Sir.
Sir, I can't see very, I'm sorry. The light. Hedges, Hitchens,
Mr. Hedges.
Adam, sir.
Yeah, I'm going to come there and beat you up.
Okay. Later.
Okay. It seems to me that most religions deal with operational aspects of life, such as human capital development, that is the accumulation of literacy and technology, economic development, mental and physical well-being, and public service, which deals with charity and those kinds of things.
These are the work of religion, you're saying?
Yes, that they profess this, yes. And that all faiths profess these things, and since they do, should we just abandon these labels and stop calling ourselves Jews, Christians, or Muslims, or whatever, and deal with the operational facts of life, which deal with, again, human capital, literacy, economic development, mental and physical well-being, and public service and charity, helping others, without the labels.
Rabbi?
If I understand your question correctly, I would say this. The largest organized groups of charities in the world, over and over and over again, all around the world, organize themselves around religious groups. I don't think that that's a mistake, and I don't think that that's a coincidence. So that, in fact, if you disband the idea that we're doing this as a religious group, you will, in one stroke, undo a great deal of the good that happens in the world. So, no, I think that communities, which, by the way, without religions, I don't know where you get communities where young and old sit together in common purpose. It's very rare, especially in our atomized society. If you disband that, I think you'll get trouble.
Christopher, without community, without the labels?
Implied in what David says is that a person exists who would say, now that I don't believe in God, I'll stop giving money to charity. I don't care anymore. I don't think there is such a person. And if that were so, it would be a very strange religion that they'd been professing.
Who will organize good works in the absence of religion?
But why is it that in survey after survey, religious people do give more, and religious people watch less television and use drugs less and use alcohol less?
This is what religion is down to.
It has social utility.
It's very impressive to me.
Okay, good.
It's very often the first thing. When we debate with Catholics, they always change the subject to charity right away. With Jews, it's usually a little later.
You just said that they...
And with Muslims... And with Muslims, it's
at the very
all the time. Because what else can they don't want to defend their faith.
But you just said the opposite. You just said that
they don't want to
didn't believe you wouldn't do it.
They don't want to defend their faith. They don't want to say, they feel uneasy talking about redemption, salvation, all this kind of thing. But look at the good work we've done. If you talk to the Mormons, they'll say, you may not think much of Joseph Smith. And I say, you got that right. But, boy, you should see our missionaries in Peru.
So government will do the work if religion does not?
Excuse me,
government?
What has this got to do with the existence of God or the validity of religious claims? It has nothing to do with it,
social
which
utility.
is why it's always introduced as a time-wasting tactic.
Wait. No, don't applaud that.
Nothing to do with it.
He just... But... All right, all of you who applauded, I just want to ask you this. If Christopher says to me, God doesn't exist, and I say, but we do good things, he's got a point. But his previous comment was, people who don't believe in religion do good things. In response, I say, in response to the question, people who believe in religion do good things to a greater extent. And then he says, well, why aren't you talking about whether God exists? You made an argument against the social utility of religion. I then made an argument for the social utility of religion, and you turned theological on me.
I have not conceded that it's to a greater extent. Let me give you an example. With the great Brazilian photographer, Sebastião Salgado, whose wonderful work on the primary producers of the Third World, you ought to be familiar. One of the great photographers. He's the ambassador, as the UNICEF calls it, the United Nations Children's Fund, for the eradication of polio. I went with him all over Bengal. We got it down to the point where, except for a few bits of Afghanistan and El Salvador, polio was almost gone from the world. It could go with smallpox, not a small thing, done by UNICEF, a secular organization. And we nearly a date was announced, but we were pretty sure polio would be gone. And it spread back, because largely Muslim groups in Nigeria, and also in parts of Bengal and Afghanistan, told people, don't go get your children inoculated. It's a plot by scientists and Jews and others to sterilize Muslims. And that plus the Hajj, that plus the wonderful devotional habit of going to Mecca all the time and taking all your diseases with you, has meant that polio is back all the way across Africa now. So I'm not going to have it said that in order to do good, you've got to be more religious than someone who...
It's complicated, but I want another question, if I may, sir.
All the practical evidence is the other way, and it's nothing to do with the claims of faith. Nothing.
Okay.
Yes, I have a question for both of you regarding the existence of a universal morality. My question for Mr. Hitchens, is there one? And if so, where does it come from? And my question for the rabbi is, if there is one, and it's, for example, in the 613 mitzvot, how do you personally pick and choose which ones to follow? Because I notice, you're not wearing tzitzit and some of the other prescriptions. So if it's
they might be under my shirt.
Well, there are, I won't go there. But generally speaking, can you be a good Jew and not follow the 613 if that is the prescription for universal morality?
Well, the most commonly taken universal, absolute moral statement is what's sometimes called the Golden Rule, which, well, Rabbi Hillel says, don't do to another person what would be repulsive to you. Others say, do as you would be done by, just putting it the other way. It's in the Analects of Confucius. Very few societies don't have it. So I think that's what we'd have to take as the nearest to an absolute. It's obviously subject to various relativities, alas. For one thing, it's only really as good as the person saying it. Should I not do to Charles Manson what I don't want him to do to me? Well, if you see what I mean. I mean, should we say, let's do to Charles Manson what we wouldn't want done to ourselves? Obviously not. It's just like the contradiction between the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which would lead to a very eyeless and toothless world. And then the Nazarene says, you can't condemn anyone unless you can cast the first stone. Actually, that bit was knitted into the Bible quite late and is almost certainly a fabrication. But it's believed in by many Christians who, as you know, will believe practically anything. But if you can't condemn anyone without being yourself without sin, then we can't even arrest Charles Manson unless we were sinless ourselves. So these moral absolutes are actually more full of moral relativism than you might think. And the reason people want there to be absolutes is this: they want there to be an absolute authority who can give them to you. Because wouldn't that save you all the trouble of thinking out ethics for yourself? Which is where I started. Why not take that chance? More enjoyable, less subject to appalling commandments to stone witches and murder homosexuals.
Very good, and all the rest.
Yeah, all that.
Rabbi,
And what I'm going to tell you today is that science and religion are incompatible, simply, completely, irreconcilably incompatible. And I can give you the bottom line message in case anybody needs to leave, and that is that science and religion are incompatible in the same sense that the serious pursuit of knowledge about reality is incompatible with bullshit. Now, whenever I make these arguments, and if you read my blog, you know I've talked about this a few times. Whenever I make these arguments, I always get this same set of complaints. So before I get into my argument, I got to deal with this counter-argument that I constantly hear. Because what will always happen is that, well, I hate to put it this way, but there's always some wanker somewhere who will leap out of his seat when you say science and religion are incompatible, and they'll squeak out, no, it's not true. I'm a scientist, and I go to church every Sunday. Or they will say something like they know somebody who is both a scientist and a Christian. Or they will cite famous people like Ken Miller and Francis Collins, who are definitely scientists, and most definitely vocal Christians. And then I have to say, okay, sit down. I'm not disputing that. It's a waste of all of our time to make this argument. Anyone who advances that very silly argument ought to be deeply embarrassed. So what I'm doing right now is I'm being charitable, and this is to any of you squeaky wankers out there. All right? I'm forestalling your argument and encouraging you to avoid making an ass of yourself in the Q&A. Not that anyone would do that at this conference. So here's the problem with that argument. Let me tell you about Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is definitely an evil man. I have no hesitation about using that word in reference to him. He's more notoriously known as the BTK Strangler. BTK stands for bind, torture, kill. He's a serial killer, okay? He's murdered at least 10 people by torture. And he wrote these ghastly, gloating letters to the police, taunting them and bragging about these horrible crimes he'd committed. He's an unforgivable psychopath. There's just no arguing with that. And he's now, fortunately, locked away deep in a federal penitentiary where we all hope he will rot. But here's the thing, he's also a Christian. He was a devout member of the Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas. He was there for 30 years. He was elected president of the Congregation Council, and he was also a Cub Scout leader. Which leads one to ask, is serial killing compatible with Christianity? Now, this is an audience of well-informed atheists, and so I imagine you're all mentally reviewing the historical evidence, the history of Christianity, picturing crusades, pogroms, all these kinds of atrocities, inquisitions, etc. And you're all thinking, yeah. But let's be charitable, okay? We'll be charitable here. Christianity has gradually moderated its intolerance over the years. Nowadays, it's not quite as rabid as it used to be. Which reminds me of the best definition of a new atheist I've ever heard. A new atheist is just any old atheist that the Catholic Church can't legally set on fire anymore. But I think honestly and seriously that we'd agree. Serial killing is incompatible with modern Christianity. It's incompatible with modern Christian thought, and also incompatible with the high-minded ideals of the religion. And I will agree that religion does have many high-minded, good ideals to it. The Christians, I'm sure, would also agree with me even more enthusiastically that Dennis Rader is not acting as an agent of Christian ideals. The fact that a few deranged individuals are Christian, or even that the majority of criminals in the United States, and I imagine in Australia too, are also Christian, does not mean that the philosophy and values of Christianity endorse criminality in any way. And I hasten to add, serial murder is probably also incompatible with being a good Cub Scout, for the same reasons. Okay, but let me give you another example from a different angle. Kary Mullis is a very well-known scientist. He discovered PCR. And any of you who are scientists here know all about this. PCR is the polymerase chain reaction. It's a technique for rapidly amplifying known DNA sequences in a sample. And it was a brilliant insight, no doubt about it. PCR machines are ubiquitous in labs all around the world. And Mullis won a Nobel for this discovery. Unfortunately, he's also a certifiable kook. He wrote an autobiography called Dancing Naked in the Minefield, which I recommend highly if you want to read something that's entertaining in a trippy train wreck sort of way. It's that kind of book. Anyway, in this book he talks about all these recreational drugs he takes, all about the women he's had sex with. He explains how HIV doesn't cause AIDS. Nowadays he tours the country talking about how global climate change is not occurring. He also talked about how ESP is possible, and one afternoon, when he was playing with his computer, he proved that astrology actually works. It's all in the book. It's an amazing book. Now the question is Kary Mullis a scientist? And yes, definitely I would say he is. He has a Nobel Prize. You know, they can't get a much better badge of being a scientist than that. PCR was genuinely a great scientific discovery. Does that imply, though, that every thought that scampers through Mullis's well-doped brain is scientific? No, certainly not. Is astrology compatible with science because one scientist believes he has scientifically demonstrated it? No, I would say not. That what we've got here is a simple case of the fact that people are complicated. We are complicated animals. Our brains hold all kinds of false and contradictory ideals, and different people have different ideas. Imagine that. And those ideas have to be evaluated independently of the person holding them, or whatever other odd ideas are tumbling about in the grab bag of their cranium, except for mine, of course, which is perfectly pure. And as you will say, yours is too, I'm sure. When we try to claim that because so-and-so is a scientist, that every thought in his head must be automatically legitimate in the scientific sphere, we're making a glorified argument from authority. We are making a logical fallacy. There's plenty of room for each one of us to be wrong. Also, this defense of scientific compatibility, I've noticed, is always brought up to support religion. and nothing else. If I tried to argue that my fondness for cheesy science fiction movies like Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus, okay? If I said because I like those, I have a good time watching them, they are therefore scientifically accurate and validated because I am a scientist, I don't think I'd get very far. I don't think you'd swallow that argument. You will not ever hear that argument from me, except as a joke. Now, religion, of course, is the mega shark of culture. It's basically improbable nonsense that tickles our brains in amusing ways, but it's unreliable. It's an outright falsehood in many ways, and it's often been falsified. And in addition, the CGI is really bad. Now, I have to add another qualification here. My complaint with religion isn't that it necessarily turns people into terrorists. I've often heard this argument. Religion doesn't make people fly into airplanes, or fly airplanes into buildings, and it doesn't necessarily turn them into misogynistic tyrants, although, yes, I will agree, sometimes it does. I honestly believe from my experience that almost all religious people are good, decent, ordinary human beings, sharing many of the same values, such as love of family, a desire for economic stability, and a willingness to get along within their tribe at least, that almost all of us here in this room share. I actually think it's a huge tactical mistake for our movement to criticize religion on the basis of the pathological extremes, because most of the people we want to persuade in the follies of their beliefs don't see them as agents of the monstrous excesses of zealotry. The part of religion that makes it open to criticism, and which really makes it incompatible with science, is not that it makes you evil, it's that it's wrong and it makes you stupid. And to further this argument, what I would say is that, many of the religious apologists out there are not stupid people. They are often brilliant people working in the field of theology and philosophy, smart people everywhere. What they are, though, is the religious apologists, at least, are smart people who can build these amazingly intricate rationalizations for whatever weird practice they favor, whether it's ritual cannibalism, or praying to spirits, or treating women as chattel. And they always build this on this terrible shaky foundation of false premises. The justifications they construct can either lead to, for instance, institutionalized charity, which I think is a good thing. Religion has had some promising successes that way. But it can also lead to tribalism and holy war, which I think is generally a bad thing. And either one is about equally supported when your source of authority is an invisible man in the sky who whispers these inaudible orders into the brains of his priests. Okay, there's no way to evaluate which of those answers is the best. And that's my primary gripe with religion as a scientist. Not necessarily it makes good people do evil things, because I'm thinking I'm the kind of person who optimistically believes that most people are out to do good for their fellow human beings, and they use faith like a Ouija board to just express their desires. No, it's not because they're evil, it's because religion makes smart people do stupid things, and scientists do not like stupid. So I'm going to give you an example now, and this is an example of Ken Miller. Ken Miller is an American scientist. He's a cell biologist. And trust me, he's a really smart guy. Okay, I read his work. He knows what he's doing. He's also an excellent speaker, and he's been a very hardworking asset in combating creationism in the United States. I'm going to criticize the fellow very strongly here, but let me emphasize, I want Ken Miller to keep doing most of what he's been doing, because he is a real benefit to the cause of science education. And the reason I'm picking on him, rather than Ken Ham, who happens to be Australian, thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate the apologies. Ken Ham is an irredeemable moron, okay? So he's not a good example for my argument. On the other hand, Ken Ham is a good, smart scientist. And what I want to make a case for is that religion has poisoned his brain and made him think some very, very stupid things. That's the danger of religion. Okay, here's a specific example. So Ken Miller's a biologist. He's familiar with the evidence for evolution, and fortunately, Catholicism has no official complaint with evolution because Ken Miller is a Catholic. He keeps on telling us he's a Catholic. It's part of his shtick, okay? So Catholicism has no official complaint with evolution, and much of Miller's popular writings are all about why evolution is a fact, and he's very good at knocking down the follies of creation. See, he's a smart guy. But then the problem with his writings emerge whenever he has to try and reconcile evolution, which is an impersonal force with some rather heartless and cruel implications, with his Catholic belief in a loving God who intentionally created us. There is absolutely no scientific evidence for such a being. There is no evidence that we are the product of anything but chance funneled through the filter of natural selection. And Miller knows this. He knows there is no scientific evidence for his beliefs. So he had to invent a loophole. He had to invent this contrived little excuse to wedge his God somewhere in the whole process of evolution. And he does it in a way that excuses the absence of evidence. So he makes what he likes to call explicitly scientific arguments that God is found in a process called quantum indeterminacy. Okay? That is because the behavior of subatomic particles is not fully predictable. There's a lot of slop in the behavior of what these things do at a very tiny level of the universe. And what Miller likes to claim is that God can intervene in subtle, undetectable ways. God is playing with loaded dice, and he's really good at putting in a fair set of dice whenever we try to scrutinize the process. So basically he's saying God cheats at physics. And of course the operative word here is undetectable. He's saying you cannot see this. Now I have to cite a real authority here, Terry Pratchett. Who once said, "Let's call it quantum is not an explanation." Now, can I disprove his assertion? No, Miller has carefully crafted his explanation to be completely untestable. And as anyone with even a passing familiarity with science can tell you, untestable explanations with no supporting evidence at all are not scientific. They're what we call in technical terms bullshit. It's an entirely religious argument. And I'm using that word in the same sense as saying it's a really stupid argument. For one thing, you have to ask, okay, how does Ken Miller know that his God worked by nudging an occasional cosmic ray into bumping into a particular nucleotide in the DNA of our ancestors? Because I know no one has seen that. And he's even admitted there's no evidence for this. It's unobservable. You can't detect this. The entire point of this exercise is to invent a way for God to do something without ever doing anything. So how does he know this? Well, he doesn't. And what it seems like is that Miller hasn't read what should be everyone's source book for the basic principles of critical thinking. And by that I mean, everyone probably knows this already, Carl Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark. I strongly recommend that Miller should read the chapter titled, The Dragon in My Garage. Does anyone know this one? Are you familiar with this? Yes, of course. It's precisely the story that Miller is telling us, without any quantum, of course. If you haven't read it already, though, run out and buy it. It's marvelous. This is one of the best books you can read if you want to learn about how to think like a scientist. But to summarize it, he's telling a little fable about keeping a fire-breathing dragon in his garage, except that it's invisible and it floats so it doesn't leave tracks, and its fire is heatless, And it's not corporeal, so you can't touch it. It's a lot like God, constantly being removed from the realm of reality as people pursue it. And Sagan's conclusion is the smart one. It's how we should treat God and how we should treat Miller's little quantum story, in that the only sensible approach is tentatively to reject the dragon hypothesis, to be open to future physical data, and to wonder what the cause might be that so many apparently sane and sober people share the same strange delusion. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it does.
During the debate between Christopher Hitchens and Rabbi David, which we watched at some point in the video, the discussion kept coming back to the rabbi claiming that religious people are likelier to give to charity compared to all other people, basically atheists and agnostics. You and I. And the thought that popped into my mind every single time they circled back to that argument was, that's easily the biggest half-truth argument if I've ever had one. So, I'll try to paint the whole picture for you right now, but to do that I'll have to tell you a short story, guys. Please don't click off, I promise that it will be brief and it's heading somewhere, so here it goes. If you asked me today who pops into my mind when I think of the kindest people that I've ever met in my life, one guy easily makes it into that list. His name was Abdul. Of course, I've changed his name for the sake of this video. I'm not in the business of exposing myself to litigation if you can't tell already, but I have picked the name I have deliberately, and so I can give full credit to where credit is due. So, Abdul is a Muslim fellow, and he was easily one of, if not the nicest fellow in our whole high school. We attended the same boarding school, him and I. If you needed some help with anything in school, Abdul was your go-to guy, and it never mattered if you are 3 classes behind him or one of the most disliked students in the school. He was ready to help anyone, anytime that he could. I can even vividly remember Abdul unfairly lashing out at this kid that he had gotten in a disagreement with at some point, but he immediately calmed himself down and apologized to the fellow in front of everyone, man. I don't know about the schools you attended, but this kind of behavior was unheard of in every school that I've ever gone to. And you know, it's interesting because Abdul always credited his religion for his good deeds. He even mentioned several times that he believed he would have been a naughty kid were it not for religion setting him on the right track in life. Now, fast forward to my last year in that school. It's around 10 p.m. and we're all heading to our dormitories for the night. Before we got to the dormitory where I usually slept in, which was on the far end of the school compound, we heard a lot of commotion coming from a dormitory that was specially designated for first year students. Naturally, we head there to see what's popping, man, and we find that apparently one of the students had just been found wearing a shirt that did not belong to him. So the natural conclusion among his peers was that he was a thief. Without skipping a beat, man, one of the students we had come in with took off his shirt, pushed this first year student into a corner and proceeded to beat him senselessly, man, for, 30 seconds or so before the rest of us were able to jump in and pull him back from the kid. By this point, the suspected student was bleeding through his nose. Now, will you like to guess the name of the student who took off his shirt and proceeded to beat down the other student that was suspected to be a thief? Yeah, man, you guessed it right. It was Abdul. And with each blow Abdul landed, he would proclaim just how much his religion hated thieves and why what he was doing to the kid was actually showing him mercy according to Allah's instructions. Apparently, the fully justified punishment according to the Quran would have been cutting off both his hands. So Abdul really did believe that simply beating him up senselessly was showing him mercy. Now, gratefully, the school the following day would promptly promptly expelled Abdul, and I believe the victim's parents pressed charges as well, though I never know what became of that. And you know what's even worse, man? Upon further investigation by the school, the kid wasn't a thief after all. I'm sure the shot did not belong to him, but he had every good reason to believe that it did. As with most schools in Africa, we wore identical uniforms, and it was usually up to each individual student to have a unique mark that will help them tell their uniforms apart. Coincidentally, the two students, the one the shot belonged to and the suspected thief, had bought new shirts that week, and so when the suspect went to the hanging line and saw a new shirt, he promptly concluded that it must have been the one that belonged to him and beknownst to him his had been stolen and he had just taken someone else's property. I understand some might want to dismiss this as a fake story, but cross my heart, man, it's 100% true with a few details changed up a bit, of course, to avoid any issues. And also it might sound as if I've singled out Islam, but that wasn't my intention, man. And after all, these barbaric laws can be found in all three Abrahamic religions. It just so happens that some stupid sects of all, again, three religions, think that their fantasy novels should be understood literally. So, what was the point of me telling you this story? Well, as the rabbi was pointing out, sure, a lot of good is done by people in the name of religion. There is no denying that, man. But it's also quite obvious that a lot of evil and misfortune has been perpetrated in the name of these same religions. As Christopher Hitchens pointed out in the same video, we have religious groups against vaccinations scattered across the globe, from the United States to the other end of the world, man. Not to mention the anti-reproductive and anti-expression laws that have been passed by governments all around the world in the name of religion. And also don't forget the countless violent acts that have been carried out by fundamentalist believers worldwide in the name of religion. Trust me, if we could accurately count down the number of people that have been affected both directly and indirectly by these religious in the last 5 years alone, it will be in the hundreds of millions at least. I don't know about you guys, but that doesn't sound like a worthy trade-off to me, man. Also, the claim that if we eradicated religion today, people wouldn't donate to charities to a similar degree is laughable, man. Sure, the majority of charity dollars go to religion at 32% approximately, but that still leaves 8%, man, which is a significant majority. And to claim that the 32% will stop giving altogether simply because religious leaders aren't asking them to is quite the assumption, isn't it? My bet is they will eventually find new causes they care about, and once they do, they'll still give as much as they did before. And at least this time round, they won't be doing so out of fear of eternal damnation. I mean, all across Africa, you'll find a culture of getting together whenever one of our community members has an issue to raise as much as we can to aid in their misfortune. We call them Harambes in Kenya, and I can assure you guys that we were doing this long before religion found its parasitic way across the continent. So, believe it or not, man, humanity won't stop caring about each other's obvious issues simply because we do not have fantasy novels asking us to anymore. We'll be fine, man, at the end of the day. Other than that, thanks a lot for tuning in today, and I hope you've loved the hour-long conversation as much as I did, man. Please tune in the day after tomorrow for another episode of Brilliant Arguments Against Religion. And in the meantime, stay safe. Peace, man.